let's get started. So this is like, as you would probably know, or maybe even if you don't know, it's okay, that the topic of risk assessment in CISSP is part of domain 1. Okay. So these are the different topics that come under domain 1. Of course, I'm not going to be teaching you all of these concepts, all of these topics here. Otherwise, we'll be here the whole weekend. So I will only be covering a few topics related to risk assessment in this from this mind map here. All right. So let's get started. So these are the two these are the two topics that I intend to cover here. First one is security terms, as I had said before, and then the second one will be this one, risk assessment and analysis. So these are the two topics that I'm going to be covering today. So let's get started. First one is security terms. So these are some basic security terms that everybody in the information security field or anyone preparing for CISSP is expected to know. You must understand these terms really well because these are very basic terms. So it doesn't reflect very well on somebody's career or somebody's knowledge if they're not very well, they don't understand these terms really well. Okay. So first term here is the asset. What is an asset? Asset is anything that is of value. Okay. It could be of value to a person or to an organization, because in this, I mean, in our context, it will mostly be the organization. So anything that is of value to the organization will be an asset. Now, it does not need to be only a tangible asset. It could be tangible or intangible. By tangible, I mean the people, furniture, the servers, desktops, computers, laptops, all those things are tangible assets that you can see, that you can touch, right? So all of this, those things that are of value, they are your assets, they are organization's assets, as well as some intangible things like goodwill. So these things are also assets. So people, servers, ideas, goodwill, all of these things, anything that is of value, whether it is tangible or intangible, will be an asset for the organization. All right. Next term is vulnerability, a very, very important term. Vulnerability is nothing but a weakness in a system or application that provides a doorway for attackers to get in. So basically, it means that it is nothing but a weakness in anything in a system or application or a process or anything else. It's a weakness that can be exploited by somebody for some wrong purpose. That is a vulnerability. So if I were to give you an example, let's say you have an application and that application runs on HTTP. Now, as you would know, that HTTP is not encrypted, right? So if anybody from the internet logs into that application and they enter their credentials, there is a risk that there is a possibility that some attacker could intercept the connection and they could look into the traffic that is going over that connection, which means that they could look into the credentials and any other communication, any other important traffic that is going over that HTTP connection, because it is not encrypted. And that is a vulnerability, right? That is a weakness that somebody with the right knowledge, with the right means, can exploit. So that is a vulnerability. Another example of a vulnerability could be a router which has got telnet enabled over the internet, right? So if telnet is enabled, then that means, and if it is enabled over the internet, that means anybody on the internet can access the router using telnet. Now, the problem with telnet is that it is not encrypted, just like HTTP. And if it is not encrypted, attackers can intercept the connection and they can see what all commands you are sending to the router, what username, password did you type to enter to get into that router. So that is another example of a vulnerability, a weakness that can be exploited. Okay. Next term is a threat. So where we have a vulnerability, a weakness, we have a threat. So what is a threat? A threat is a potential danger. So it's nothing but a potential danger. So for example, in the previous example of a router where telnet was enabled over the internet, what is the threat? What is the potential danger? The potential danger is that some hacker or some attacker could intercept the network administrator's connection over the internet, and they could look at the username and password that is being entered to log into the router. That is the potential danger, right? That is the threat. So like this also says here, if a home router is accessible from internet on default password, then threat is someone could log into the router and modify the configuration. That's another weakness. If the default password has not been changed, then anybody can log into that router from the internet. And if the router is accessible from the internet on the default password, then anybody on the internet can log into that router using the default password and then modify the configuration. So that's another vulnerability. The vulnerability is the default password not changed, and the threat is that anybody can log into it. That is the potential danger. Okay. Now, the next term related to threat is a threat agent. So, who is a threat agent? Threat agent is that entity that exploits the vulnerability. Okay, because if there is a threat somewhere, that threat would not materialize on its own, right? Somebody has to cause that threat. So, who is that cause? Who is that entity that exploits the vulnerability? That is called a threat agent. It could be a process, it could be a person, or anything else, but that entity that exploits the vulnerability, that is called a threat agent. It could also be called a threat actor. So threat actor or threat agent, it's one and the same thing. So it's the potential cause of an unwanted incident. That is the threat agent. Okay. Now, threat and threat agent, as you can see, these are different, but in real life, you will see that these two terms are used interchangeably. Okay. So don't get confused if you see the term threat being used when technically speaking, ideally threat agent term should have been used. So understand the difference between these two terms, but also understand that sometimes in real life and in a lot of books, in certain cases, you will see that the terms are used interchangeably. Okay. Next, very, very important term is risk. So what is risk? Now, risk is made up of two things. First one is the probability, the likelihood of something bad happening. Okay. Because where there is a vulnerability, there is a threat, right? So if there is a vulnerability, we know that it could be exploited by some threat agent or threat actor. So, but there is a probability of that happening, right? There is a probability that some threat agent could exploit the vulnerability. That probability could be high, that probability could be low, but there is a probability, right? Or a likelihood. It's one and the same thing. So there are two parts to risk. First one is that there is a probability of something bad happening, and what happens when that probability materializes, when that vulnerability is actually exploited. What is the resulting damage that happens? What is the resulting business impact when that vulnerability is actually exploited? So when you combine these two things, first one is the probability, and the second one is the resulting damage, the resulting business impact. When you combine these two things, you get risk. Okay. So once again, what is risk? Risk is made up of two things. First one is the probability of something going wrong. And if that something were to actually go wrong, what will be the resulting business impact? That will be the that when you combine these two, that you will get risk. Okay. So for example, if let's say you have an application and it has got some vulnerability, you know that there is a vulnerability, and now you want to calculate the risk of that application because of that vulnerability. Now you may say that, hey, yes, we have this vulnerability in the application, but it will require somebody with really good technical knowledge, really complex technical skills to be able to exploit this vulnerability. So after some analysis, you may say that the probability or the likelihood of this vulnerability getting exploited is low. Or maybe you could say that on a scale of 1 to 5, it is 2 or even 1. Or maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, it is 3 or 4. So you can use your own scale of probability or likelihood. You can say that, okay, it is really low. The probability is really low that somebody could exploit this vulnerability. So that is one part. However, if somebody was able to exploit this vulnerability, no matter how low the probability is, it could still happen, right? So if somebody were to actually exploit this vulnerability, what will be the damage? Then you could say that, hey, this is a really critical server, and if this vulnerability were to get exploited, then the damage could be really high. So in this case, the combination is that probability is low, but the damage, the business impact is high. When you combine these two things, that is when you get risk. Okay. Next one is exposure. So what is exposure? Exposure is nothing but the instance of being exposed to losses. So like I said earlier, if you have a router that is available over the internet, over telnet, then you are exposed to the fact that somebody could look into your credentials as they're traversing over the network, and then they could hack into your router, right? That is the exposure, the instance of being exposed to losses. For example, if an internet facing application does not have encryption enabled, it is exposed to its communication being snooped. So that is exposure. Okay. The last term, again, a very important term, is control, or it is also known as countermeasure. It is also known as safeguard. So in the exam, if you see the words control, countermeasure, safeguard, it's one and the same thing. So what exactly does it mean? It means that it is the mechanism that you put in place to mitigate certain risks. So that now that you have identified a vulnerability and you have analyzed it, you have found out you have analyzed the probability, you have analyzed the business impact or the damage, and you have come up with the risk. Next step is to put some controls in place so that the risk can be brought down to an acceptable level. Okay, and those controls that you put in place, that is that is what a control is, right? The mechanisms that you put in place to mitigate the risk, that is called a control or a countermeasure or a safeguard. Okay, so those are the basic security terms that you are expected to know.